Hi again. I am so pleased to introduce the next conversation, Enabling Entrepreneurship Everywhere. Please join me in welcoming Heidi Moore, business editor at Mashable, Dambisa Moyo, global economist and author, Ashish Thakur, founder of Mara Group and Mara Foundation, and the fabulous Elizabeth Gore, entrepreneur in residence at Dell. Welcome.
So thank you all for being here. I'm sure you've seen some amazing things today, but have you seen a superhero? I don't think so.
Entrepreneurs are superheroes.
That's right.
Right.
And wearing heels, as many quiet superheroes do.
That's right. That's right.
So tell us a little bit about why you're wearing a cape.
Well, I fundamentally believe that entrepreneurs are going to be the ones solving the SDGs, and that they are the ones who disrupt and bring the best technologies. They're creating 90% of jobs in the world, and so they're superheroes. They're going to save the world.
So money does have these incredible powers to accomplish social good, and that's what we're going to talk about, how to use money to do good in the world. And that a lot of that comes through entrepreneurship, which is not just money, it's a combination of money and passion. And there's a lot of passion on this stage today. So first I'd want to talk about why is it so hard to be an entrepreneur and to do social good? Do you want to start?
So, I think the most important thing is the context in which entrepreneurs are asked to basically follow their dreams. And I think it's pretty clear that the political environment and public policy have an important role in creating an environment in which entrepreneurs can thrive, they can find capital, they can find talent, but also they can road test their ideas. And so when governments in particular in places in the emerging world tend to be very difficult in terms of things like ability for entrepreneurs to do business. So the World Bank's Doing Business survey is a great example of evidence that it can be very difficult to get a business license. Aside from capital and talent access, I think those are really important and easy wins that we can have where public policy can encourage entrepreneurship. Of course, more generally, government's role in terms of providing some framework for regulatory environments, but also making sure that markets clear are very important aspects, and of course also providing public goods, so infrastructure, etc., education and healthcare are ways in which public policy can help to support entrepreneurship.
Right, so no one does it alone, but that issue that you mentioned of getting governments to cooperate can often be very difficult for entrepreneurs. They are pragmatic people, they're people of business, and the world of diplomacy can often be very challenging. Elizabeth, what have you seen that works and what doesn't work in terms of getting public policy to cooperate with entrepreneurship?
Well, we actually, at Dell, for example, we've put a lot of muscle behind public policy. So we are very focused on supporting the UN and Sustainable Development Goal 8, which was free and equal work for all for job creation and entrepreneurship. But policy for entrepreneurs is critical from the county level or all the way up to the national level, so states, counties, and so on. And everything from how do we look at immigration, how do we look at taxation, how do we access talent, and then access to capital. And what I'm excited about with Sustainable Development Goal 8 is it really gives a roadmap for countries on what is the best ecosystem for entrepreneurship. But I think what's critical is entrepreneurs have to start using their voice and dialoguing with policymakers to do that. They have to be their own advocates.
And how do they start doing that? How do you open that conversation?
Well, I think first of all is don't be intimidated. I know most entrepreneurs are heads down. They're trying to get profitable. They're probably out fundraising and so on, but they have to lift up and look around them and dialogue. And right now in the U.S., for example, we have the elections going, so get in there, get in those debates and talk about it.
That's great. And so what policies have you seen that have worked particularly well? Is there an example that stands out to you?
Well, in the United States, during the Jobs Act from 2013, crowdfunding actually was opened up. And now it's almost a $16 billion opportunity. That is a huge deal. In the UK, they now have tax incentives for entrepreneurs the day they open their businesses. So we need to look at that. But there's also baseline policies, particularly for women entrepreneurs, where are they even allowed to have bank accounts? Are they even allowed to have access to capital? So if you look at a sliding scale, every country is going to have their own needs for entrepreneurs.
And there's actually a remarkable statistic that the US is actually the best for women entrepreneurs, right? Can you mention that statistic?
Sure, there is a scorecard out there called the Gender Jedi, and 31 countries were rated, and the US is actually the #1 country, but it only scored 70% still. And with the major fault being the access to capital for women in this country. And you go down a sliding scale to where Pakistan is on the bottom. But we need to really understand what these are: access to markets, networks, the ability to do partnerships, and so on. So when you're only getting 7% of capital to women in this country, you can imagine that issue globally.
Right. Now, Ashish, you've worked with entrepreneurs very closely for a long time. What creative ways have you seen them use to get around some of the obstacles in public policy?
I think it's an ecosystem approach, right? So you've got to look at enabling entrepreneurship in the true sense through a few different angles. So firstly, the whole access to informal education, mentorship. I think mentorship is such a crucial piece because entrepreneurship isn't taught in the formal education system. So mentorship is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. At the same time, access to capital in forms of debt and equity. We need banks to lend to businesses more, particularly SMEs. And lastly, the public policy angle, I think it's government's role, Dambisa touched on it, which is the whole enabling framework, right? Creating that framework which does enable young entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs to thrive in business. And that's in so many different angles. I mean, in Africa, there's certain countries where the labor law for a big mining company is the same as that of a startup. So if you fire someone in a startup, you've got to put 12 to 18 months of their salary in an escrow account. Now, it's just not a practical thing. So we need to make these tweaks in order to really solve this. And I think the big answer to unemployment, which is a global issue, is nurturing small and medium enterprises in a true sense, is truly enabling, empowering, and inspiring young entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs. So everyone but old men. And I think that's a perfect solution.
But can they count on the old men for any help?
We don't need them. No, I think it is an ecosystem, and I think we do need to look at this. And just to build on what Elizabeth said, I think on SDG goal number 8, these are all interconnected. I mean, if you really focus on that, good jobs and growth in the economy and innovation, which is goal number 9, you're going to solve goals 1 and 2, which is, no hunger and poverty, but also directly have an impact on gender equality, which is goal 5, general reducing inequalities, which is goal 10. So this is all interconnected, and I think entrepreneurship is such a crucial piece to finding these solutions.
Right. Well, it goes back to one of the core values of entrepreneurship, right, which is networking, which is building a network. And it becomes very difficult when you have to do that globally, but also potentially very rewarding. Where have you seen that work really well in terms of how entrepreneurs can approach building in emerging markets or even across the world in a network way?
So before I answer that, can I just make a specific point around the SDGs? I think every now and then there's a lot of euphoria and energy put around frameworks. And having just a few minutes ago outlined what I think are the 3 core essential aspects of the government's role, I just want to make it absolutely clear that in my perspective, that we shouldn't get hung up on frameworks such as the SDG and MDGs. Of course, they're relevant as touch points to provide guides, but I think that the core issue and the real problem that the world has faced is a lack of execution. And I think that's a pretty good segue into your question. I think that there is absolutely a role for big business. I actually think there's a role for old men as well, just to pick up on Ashish's point. And I think that, and I know you were joking, by the way, so I'm just kidding.
I wasn't.
He said it, not I. I tried to give him a bailout, but anyway, no. But anyway, the salient point is that I think it's really important that we understand that whether it's healthcare, education, or entrepreneurship, or infrastructure, I mean, we tend to know what needs to be done, but where we fall down is on execution. And I think you asked me for specific examples on where I've seen networks or environment created where we've seen a sort of support for private sector, entrepreneurs. And I would say that still the private sector business model really has a lot of kernels in that space. It's not the only place, but certainly in my experience, I sit on a number of boards for large global businesses that hire 140,000, 100,000 people around the world. And the challenge there is to constantly disrupt those businesses so that they are focused on more innovation and entrepreneurship. But I think that they do have an absolute important role, not just in terms of being an engine for business and entrepreneurship, but also for social good. I mean, just yesterday at CGI, there was a lot of talk about the role of the private sector in dealing with the Ebola crisis, for example. So I think that's an important point to stress.
Right, and very much to that point, a lot of those corporations, especially large ones, have actually created dedicated groups to disrupt major problems, especially in emerging markets, and and they use that as a route to mentorship as well, as a way to rise within the company as a young executive. But that doesn't solve one of the key problems, which is access to capital. We know what the situation in Silicon Valley is like. If you tack social media onto your name, you will get funding. For social good, that may not be as prevalent. So,
unless you're a woman.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, only 3% of women that have tech companies are getting funding. So I just wanted to put that.
That's amazing. Well, that's a lot of work that we have to do, right? I mean, if 97% of the companies are being funded by men, that's an imbalance.
Yeah.
And so then what are the best ways to solve this, or where have you seen it work very effectively?
So I'm eternally an optimist. I mean, I think that there are new and innovative ways to fund, actually microfinance is a great example, smaller projects, but peer-to-peer lending, and we're seeing this, and I happen to sit on the board of a very large global bank. This is a very key piece of our discussion, because we do recognize that the traditional model of having collateral and in a particularly defined way, perhaps as an in-house or in a car, doesn't work for everyone. And I mean, it's absolutely at the heart of the discussion, and where fintech plays an important role in that. I mean, I think that we're seeing that in our ability to transport money from one place to another, and I think that our ability as traditional organizations to capitalize on what's happening in innovation and more sort of new organizations, I think is very much at the core of our survival and the survival of the business long term.
Right. To your point about fintech, a lot of financial power moves through emerging markets on flip phones, right? None of us have flip phones anymore, but they're moving millions, thousands of dollars in various economies.
But I think, just to build on that, the whole disruptive force, in Africa, we've been able to leapfrog in so many different ways, from landlines to mobiles, right? Mobile money, to your point, 42% of Kenya's GDP is through mobile money, which is why when we founded Atlas Mara, the whole thesis was that the typical banking model has been taking customers' deposits, putting it into government treasury, making 1,000 to 1,200 basis point spreads. You don't need to lend to SMEs to do well. But if you believe in Africa the way we do, those spreads are not going to exist down the line. So it's being a positive disruptive force that needs to be led by financial institutions. And I think that's going to be a big wave. At the same time, it's also encouraging the angel and venture world in our part of the world. And I think the ease of doing business in so many places, Rwanda is a fantastic case study of how that's been done. And as the UN Foundation's Global Entrepreneurship Council, we're going to be really focusing on the ecosystem of all three of these. Because even if you get one right, if the other two aren't addressed, it's not going to solve the issue.
I think another opportunity is we need to redefine the word entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur is someone who walks into a refugee camp 3 days later, figures out a way to buy and sell something, and then provides for their family. An entrepreneur is a farmer who is building capital in their community and selling those types of goods. We really think of these entrepreneurs as, I'm saying superheroes, but almost rock stars, right? So these are your billionaire tech icons, but entrepreneurs are a part of the fabric in every one of these countries. It's the backbone of these economies. So really, how do we think of them in a different way? The other thing that I would love to just die a slow death is social entrepreneurs versus entrepreneurs. You can be a profitable entrepreneur and be socially conscious and change the world, right? And so I think that, this guy is an extremely successful entrepreneur, but he also thinks about the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit, right? He's also a very good businessman. And so I think we need to really think about the entrepreneurial spirit versus how are we putting people in these different silos, because these policies really need to envelop everyone, no matter what size you're in. But to your point also, look at how do we get these SMEs what they need to scale.
Right, and very much to your point, actually, in the Syrian refugee camps, in one particular in France, there's a huge demand for books about how to start a small business, which was recently written about, which proves exactly what you're saying. Anyone can be an entrepreneur if they put their mind to it. And also about social good being part of entrepreneurship, we're seeing that in our readership. When I look at who reads articles on Mashable, it's increasingly the business articles that do best have some element of social good. More millennials are demanding that of businesses. It's the way to make money in advertising now. And so it does seem to be that it's going to be a requirement rather than a choice pretty soon.
Can I just also make a very quick point that it's very easy to sort of converge in New York and think that the challenge of creating entrepreneurship and supporting economic growth in that vein is out there in the emerging markets. An American friend of mine reminded me that actually if you travel in emerging markets where 90% of the world's population lives, the very poor still wake up every morning and they'll sell tomatoes on the roadside. The very poor in developed economies tend to be isolated in usually very tough ghettos and very, very, very difficult environments. So the notion of entrepreneurship and our ability to fund and to provide capital and advice and general support for entrepreneurship, I think it doesn't have to start out there. I mean, it's around the corner in the United States and in other developed countries. And I think that probably the discourse needs to be a bit more flexible and encompass that vantage point as well.
And so as our parting thoughts, what would be your best piece of advice for somebody who wants to learn more about this kind of entrepreneurship?
I think it's giving back in a meaningful way, but learning. Entrepreneurship is not a destination, it is a journey. So I think it's going to be a constant learning journey. But I think emerging markets are going to play a crucial role where we can learn so much from emerging markets and replicate that in the developing world as well, to Dembisa's point. So I think there's so much to be done still.
I think that entrepreneurs, they need to unite and become their own advocates. Use their voices to tell policymakers what they really need to be superheroes.
And I guess I would just say that we should probably try not to be siloed and understand that a lot of work is being done perhaps in places that you think should be excluded. So whether it's traditional businesses, public policy, and NGOs, I think there's a lot of scope for us to all work together, because ultimately our goals tend to be the same, which is to create opportunities for people around the world.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for being a great audience. And thank you to our panelists.